So I'm here today because of something that I'm very passionate about, languages. I've had an interesting relationship with them. I started Turkish, basically, when I was born, like everybody does their first language. Then at 7, I started English from scratch. That's when I really discovered that I loved learning something other than my native tongue. At about the same time, I started Arabic, for me the language of hospitality. And a bit further on, it was French, the language of refinement, and then Spanish, the language of joy, and German, the language of philosophy. Add a year of Latin, a sprinkle of Russian, and an okay grasp of Azerbaijani, and you get me. Now, even as a little girl, I was completely obsessed. My parents remember this time in my life and laugh every time they do. I was about 4 to 6 years old, and I used to march up to my room, slam the door, and just start talking to myself for hours on end. Now, this was concerning enough as it was, but the catch was that I wasn't even speaking in an actual language. It was gibberish. Now, if you had asked me at the time, I would have said as a 4-year-old, I'm speaking pretend English, or sometimes it was pretend Arabic or pretend French. I didn't know any of these languages, but I wanted to, and that's just the level of obsession that I had. But throughout the years, as I discovered more and more about my love for languages, I came back to 2 fundamental questions. Where did they come from, and where are they going? So by now, you might have started asking yourself why I'm standing here talking about languages in a TED Talk about the future. Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. Languages chronicle our society's development. They shape our mentality, and they are a gift to our species. It's something that is unique to humankind. And from the rudimentary, the most basic scratches and etches on stones in Mesopotamia to the socially constructed language of Esperanto, they chronicle our progression as a species. And so what you can do is you can go through this timeline of lingual development and sort of look to the past, asking yourself what sort of patterns emerged in language to try to see where we're going in the future. And this is actually exactly what linguists are doing today. They are referring back to the past, analyzing a lot of complicated data, and making educated guesses about where we're headed. But like linguists, in order to look to the future, we must first look to the past. So let's start there. Let's actually start with a very simple word, man. I'm sure you all know what it means. Well, 1,000 years ago, it would have simply meant human. Wer was a word that referred to males, and that led to werewolf, literally man-wolf. And wif was females, and that led to, you might have guessed, wife. And 1,000 years ago or so, man simply became gendered, and linguists don't really know why, but they know that these stuff do happen as languages develop. Another word, girl. Now, it's simple enough. And you might say there's a girl talking right now. And yes, that is true. But if you were in the 13th century and Cameron were up here right now, you would have still said there's a girl standing here talking, because girl simply meant young person. Gay girls referred to females and knave girls to males. But as time went on and young person started taking on a more dainty, gentle connotation, it became gendered in about the 16th century. So what we know is that these types of things happen when a language has been around as long as English has. But okay, we've kind of looked at how languages develop over a millennium or a couple of centuries. But the thing is, languages are developing all the time. They're developing right now as we speak from day to day. So although it is very easy to spot a change in a word over 1,000 years, it's harder to spot the subtle changes that happen between today and tomorrow and so on. So let's look at those for a bit. So let's fast forward from the 16th century to the present. It's a lot of years, but bear with me. So, for example, have you noticed that we've really started going from you talk to you are talking? About 200 or 300 years ago, it would have been very weird to say you are talking, but we're getting more progressive with our grammar. And it's completely natural to us now, but it is a small, subtle evolution of language. And another one is I start to walk to I started walking. It's another thing. It's sort of the progressiveness of the language. It's developing. And this next one's my favorite because I use it all the time when I'm with my friends. He got caught. He got selected. He got admitted. While about 100 years ago, we would have said he was caught, he was selected, he was admitted. To get is replacing to be. Now, this is kind of interesting because linguists don't really know why this is happening. It's an unusual phenomenon, but it is. And the important thing is that languages are developing. All right, so now we've sort of looked at how a language can develop over 1,000 years and how from day to day subtle changes are happening and they're going to build up to something great. So now the question really is, what is that something great? So can we predict what is going to happen? The answer is yes. Well, sort of. Linguists have been making a lot of complicated predictions about the next 100 years or so. And they are divided in their ideas, but they all come down to some common core ideas. So I'll just talk about those. One of the main things they always talk about is interlanguages. I'm sure you've heard of these. Things like Spanglish, Spanish English, and Singlish, Singaporean English. These are all around pop culture, and we hear about them all the time when we're talking around the world. Now, these normally emerge from the native language of an immigrant family merging with the English that their kids speak. It's normally English because it's such a global language. And I'm actually guilty of doing this myself because going back home and speaking Turkish with my parents, I always sprinkle in English words and phrases, a few in each sentence, like condiment. It's just easier. I mean, it avoids awkward pauses, and you can switch to a different language when you forget a word in your own. And I witnessed it a lot in the Gulf region in the Middle East, where I traveled and lived for the last 10 years before I came to Lawrenceville. The children of Arab families would almost exclusively talk in English. And when they had to talk in Arabic with their parents, or more likely their grandparents, they would talk in such a way that a person who could only speak English a few feet away could probably understand what they were saying, just from the sheer amount of English words that they were using. So I can't really judge them because it is something that I do myself. But the actual point is that linguists predict that these interlanguages are going to develop more and more, and they're going to become even more common as immigration goes on and globalization occurs. So they think that one day, Spanglish and Singlish and words and languages like those are going to become their own languages, like English and German. Another thing that they focus a lot on is Mandarin. It's really important right now in the lingual field. They predict that it will become a sort of future language of commerce and finance. And linguists do think that English is also going to continue being a very global language. So they think that in the future, these two languages might merge into a sort of supreme global language. Now, I don't know about you, but I cannot imagine Mandarin and English merging. They're just so different. And I could not even imagine what it would be called, because I don't think it would roll off the tongue as easily as Spanglish or Singlish. But I do think it would be pretty cool. All right, now going back to my point about looking to the past to predict the future, the thing is, we can't always do this. I mean, linguists have been talking about this for a very long time, and the thing is that as time changes, things change. I mean, it's a fundamental truth of history. History is never completely repeated, it only rhymes. So one major thing that linguists are thinking of right now is something called relative isolation. And let me give you an example of where this occurred. So during the fall of the Roman Empire, the citizens of the empire who spoke vulgar Latin, which is basically just slang Latin, they spread around the Mediterranean, and they grew apart. They developed in relative isolation from one another. And this actually caused them to become distinct dialects, and further on, as centuries and centuries went on, different languages. Things like Italian, Spanish, French. I mean, we can't argue right now that they're different languages, but they all started from the same root of slang Latin. So linguists think that with the development of the internet and globalization, I mean, we are completely global right now. They think that this relative isolation would just be almost impossible. You cannot separate two groups of people for enough time, centuries, sometimes a millennium, for their languages to grow apart. So they think that instead of creating new languages, a lot of the time languages might simply merge, become hybrids like Anglo-Mandarin. So these are the basic predictions for the future. I mean, they're not perfect, but they're something. And they're pretty interesting to think about. The thing is, if I wanted you to take one thing from my talk today, it wouldn't be that languages are evolving. It's just that languages are fascinating, something that I'm fascinated about. They chronicle society's development. And think about how unique it is to humanity. It is a gift, and we should cherish it. And we should look out for where we think it's going to go in the future. That's basically the point of all of this. And I just like to finish with telling you to think of this. In 500 or maybe 1,000 years from now, native English speakers, if there are any left, would be watching stuff like Mean Girls with subtitles on, because it would be like complete old English to them. And that is the development of language. Thank you.